The desert sun had already begun its merciless ascent when Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hayes received the call that would forever alter the trajectory of his life and the lives of 19 other men. The voice on the secure satellite phone was steady, professional, but, beneath the military precision, Hayes detected something else: desperation masked as duty.
"Commander, we have a situation. High-value target confirmed in the Kandahar province. Intel suggests imminent threat to civilian population. We need immediate extraction capabilities."
Hayes had been in Afghanistan for 18 months, long enough to distinguish between routine operations and the calls that carried the weight of genuine catastrophe.
This was the latter.
The intel briefing that followed painted a picture of horror: a compound holding 17 civilian hostages, including women and children, with confirmed explosive devices rigged throughout the structure. The terrorist cell responsible had already executed 2 hostages as proof of their commitment to martyrdom.
But this wasn't just another rescue mission.
The compound was situated in a valley that tactical analysis had deemed unsurvivable, a natural killing field where previous attempts had resulted in complete unit loss. The terrain offered no cover, no tactical advantage, and no margin for error. 3 previous reconnaissance missions had been aborted when advance teams detected the sophisticated defensive positions and overlapping fields of fire that made approach virtually impossible.
The briefing room fell silent as the full scope of the mission became clear.
This wasn't a request for volunteers, it was a mathematical equation with no solution.
The probability matrices showed casualty rates approaching 100% for any force attempting infiltration.
Even with air support, artillery preparation, and coordinated distraction operations, the defensive advantages were overwhelming. Hayes looked around the room at the faces of his team, men he had trained with, bled with, and trusted with his life countless times. Each face told the same story: they understood the odds, they understood the cost, and they understood that 17 innocent people would die if nobody acted. These were Navy SEALs, the most elite special operations force in the world, but they were also human beings with families, dreams, and futures that this mission would almost certainly end. "Gentlemen," Hayes began, his voice carrying none of the uncertainty that churned in his stomach, "I'm not going to lie to you about what we're facing.
The tactical assessment is clear. This is a one-way mission with odds that no reasonable person would accept. Command is not ordering this operation.
They're asking for volunteers, and they need an answer in 6 hours." The silence that followed wasn't hesitation, it was the sound of 20 minds simultaneously calculating not just their own mortality, but the weight of 17 innocent lives against their own. These men had signed up to protect others, but they had also signed up to come home to their own families. The ethical calculus was brutal in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Petty Officer First Class Davidson was the first to speak. At 28, he was one of the youngest members of the team, a demolitions expert whose precision with explosives was matched only by his devotion to his wife and infant daughter back in San Diego.
"Sir, what's the timeline for the hostages? Intel suggests 48 hours before they start systematic executions. They've already demonstrated their willingness to kill."
The weight of that timeline settled over the room like a shroud.
48 hours meant that delay wasn't an option.
It meant that if they were going to act, it had to be now, and it had to be with the full knowledge that they might not see another sunrise. Chief Petty Officer James Rodriguez, a veteran of 4 combat deployments and the father of 3 teenage children, stood slowly. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of experience and the gravity of understanding. "Sir, with respect, we all knew what we signed up for when we earned our tridents.
The question isn't whether we're willing to die for strangers.
The question is whether we're willing to live with ourselves if we don't try." The truth of Rodriguez's words hung in the air, challenging each man to confront not just his own mortality, but his own character. This was the moment that separated those who wore the uniform from those who embodied its meaning. This was the crucible where personal courage was forged into something larger than individual survival. Hayes felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders, but this time it was different. This wasn't about tactical decisions or strategic planning. This was about asking 19 men to follow him into almost certain death for people they would never meet, in a place they might never leave. The mathematics of leadership had never been starker or more unforgiving. "I need you all to understand something," Hayes continued, his voice growing stronger with each word.
If we do this, we do it knowing that the odds say we won't be coming home.
We do it knowing that the families we leave behind will have to live with our choice. We do it knowing that the world will never know what we attempted here, because successful or not, this mission will remain classified for decades. He paused, allowing the full weight of anonymity to settle. These men wouldn't die as heroes in the public consciousness. They wouldn't have monuments erected or parades held in their honor. They would die as they had lived in special operations, in shadows, without recognition, with only their teammates and their own consciences as witnesses to their sacrifice. But we also do it knowing that 17 people, including children who have done nothing wrong except exist in the wrong place at the wrong time, will live if we succeed. We do it knowing that their children and their children's children will grow up in freedom because we chose to act when action seemed impossible. The room remained silent, but the quality of that silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of men contemplating their own deaths. It was the silence of men who had already made their decision and were simply waiting for the formal moment to declare it. Sergeant Michael Thompson, the team's communications specialist, raised his hand slightly. "Sir, when do we leave?" The simplicity of the question carried the full weight of their collective decision. There was no debate, no extended discussion of alternatives, no attempts to find a safer approach. There was only the recognition that some things were more important than personal survival, and that their training, their oaths, and their character had led them inevitably to this moment. "We'll leave in 4 hours. That gives us time for final equipment checks and—" Hayes paused, the reality of what came next settling over him. "Time for anyone who wants to make personal calls." The mention of personal calls brought the human cost into sharp focus. These men would be calling wives, children, parents, and loved ones without being able to explain why. They would be saying goodbye without being able to say goodbye. They would be carrying the weight of unspoken farewells into battle. But, as Hayes looked around the room, he saw something that filled him with both pride and profound sadness. He saw 20 men who had already moved beyond the question of whether to act. They were now focused solely on how to act most effectively. The transformation from men contemplating their mortality to warriors preparing for battle was complete. The next 4 hours passed with the surreal efficiency of a dream. Equipment was checked and rechecked. Ammunition was distributed with mathematical precision. Communications protocols were reviewed until they became automatic. Each man prepared as if the mission were routine, because the alternative, dwelling on the probable outcome, would have paralyzed them with fear. But, beneath the professional preparation, each man grappled with his own version of the same question: what does it mean to willingly walk toward death for strangers? The answers were as varied as the men themselves, but they all led to the same conclusion. This was what they had trained for, what they had sworn to do, and what their consciences demanded. As the sun reached its zenith and the departure time approached, Hayes gathered his team one final time. Looking at their faces, some young, some weathered by years of combat, all marked by the gravity of what they were about to attempt, he felt the full weight of leadership settle into his bones. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady despite the turbulence in his chest, "in a few minutes, we're going to board that helicopter and fly into what every tactical manual says is suicide. We're going to do it because 17 innocent people are counting on us, and because that's who we are." He paused, studying each face, memorizing each expression, knowing that some of these men might not return. "Whatever happens in the next 24 hours, I want you to know that it has been the greatest honor of my life to serve with you. You are the finest warriors I have ever known, and, more importantly, you are the finest men I have ever known." The helicopter rotors were already spinning when they walked across the tarmac. Each step toward the aircraft was a step deeper into uncertainty, but none of the 20 men faltered. They had made their choice, and they would see it through to whatever end awaited them in the mountains of Afghanistan. As they lifted off into the harsh desert sky, Hayes looked down at the compound they were leaving behind and wondered if any of them would ever see it again. But then, he looked around at his men, his brothers, and felt something he hadn't expected. Not fear, not resignation, but a profound sense of peace. They were doing what warriors had done since the beginning of time, sacrificing themselves for others, standing between the innocent and those who would harm them, choosing courage over comfort and duty over survival. Part 2, The Crucible of Character. The helicopter descended toward the landing zone as darkness enveloped the Afghan mountains, and 20 men prepared to face a test that would strip away everything superficial and reveal the core of who they truly were. The flight had taken 6 hours, but the real journey, the one that transforms ordinary men into something extraordinary, had taken years of preparation, training, and the gradual destruction of their weaker selves. As they approached the target area, Hayes reflected on the path that had led each of these men to this moment. None of them had arrived at their current capability by accident. Each had undergone a systematic process of breaking down weakness, fear, and self-limitation to build something stronger in its place. The Navy SEAL training program wasn't just about physical conditioning or tactical skills, it was about destroying the version of yourself that accepts limitations and rebuilding someone who refuses to quit regardless of circumstances. The process had begun differently for each man, but the pattern was universal. Every one of them had faced a moment, sometimes multiple moments, where they had to choose between the comfortable path of accepting their limitations and the agonizing path of destroying those limitations. They had chosen destruction of their weaker selves, and that choice had led them here. Petty Officer Chen, the young demolitions expert, had discovered his true strength not in the weight room or on the shooting range, but in the moment during SEAL training when hypothermia was setting in during a night ocean swim and every fiber of his being screamed for him to quit. His weak self had whispered that survival was more important than pride, that his family needed him alive more than the Navy needed another SEAL, that there was no shame in recognizing his limitations. But Chen had recognized that voice for what it was, the enemy within, the part of himself that would forever limit his potential if he listened to it. So he had killed that voice, metaphorically speaking, by refusing to acknowledge its existence. He had continued the swim, completed the training, and emerged as someone fundamentally different from the person who had entered the water. The man who could have quit no longer existed. Chief Rodriguez had undergone his own destruction and rebuilding during his first combat deployment in Iraq. Pinned down by enemy fire with 3 wounded teammates, his weak self had calculated the odds and suggested that heroic gestures were for movies, that he had children to consider, that someone else could take the risk. But Rodriguez had recognized that calculation as the voice of the man he refused to be. Instead, he had systematically destroyed every excuse his mind offered for inaction. Fear of death became irrelevant when weighed against the lives of his teammates. Concern for his own family became meaningless when he considered what kind of father he would be if he abandoned his brothers in their moment of need. The voice of self-preservation was silenced by the louder voice of honor and duty. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had required years of small deaths, the death of comfort-seeking, the death of excuse-making, the death of taking the easy path. Each training exercise, each mission, each moment of choosing difficulty over ease had contributed to the systematic destruction of weakness and the construction of something unbreakable. As the helicopter touched down and the team prepared to disembark, Hayes understood that what they were about to attempt was not just a rescue mission. It was the ultimate test of their transformation from ordinary men into something extraordinary. The compound they were approaching would demand everything they had built themselves into, and it would accept no compromise, no partial effort, no reservation of strength for personal survival. The intelligence briefing had been clear about what they faced. The terrorist cell holding the hostages had spent months fortifying their position, creating overlapping fields of fire, preparing explosive charges, and establishing kill zones that would channel any rescue attempt into predetermined areas of maximum vulnerability. The tactical situation was not just difficult, it was mathematically impossible according to conventional wisdom. But conventional wisdom applied to conventional men, and these 20 warriors had systematically destroyed everything conventional about themselves. They had trained until their bodies could perform beyond normal human limits. They had prepared until their minds could calculate and execute under stress that would paralyze ordinary thinking. They had forged themselves into weapons specifically designed for impossible situations. The weak version of each man, the version that accepted limitations, that calculated odds for personal benefit, that preserved energy for self-interest, had been systematically eliminated through years of choosing the harder path. What remained were 20 men who had learned the fundamental truth that the ancient Stoics had understood: external circumstances cannot destroy a man who has already destroyed his own weakness. As they moved through the darkness toward the compound, each step was a testament to years of preparation for this exact type of moment. Their breathing was controlled not because they weren't afraid, but because they had trained themselves to function optimally regardless of emotional state. Their movements were precise not because the situation wasn't chaotic, but because they had learned to create order within chaos through disciplined action. The compound loomed ahead, lit by harsh floodlights that created deep shadows perfect for concealing defensive positions. Hayes could see the careful positioning of barriers, the strategic placement of observation posts, the calculated design of a killing field that had been prepared specifically to defeat a rescue attempt. Every element of the enemy's preparation was designed to exploit the natural human instincts for self-preservation and tactical caution. But these 20 men had spent years training themselves to operate beyond natural human instincts. They had learned to move when movement seemed impossible, to attack when attack seemed suicidal, to continue when continuation seemed pointless. They had destroyed the part of themselves that calculated personal odds and rebuilt something that calculated only mission success. The first phase of the assault required crossing 200 meters of open ground under observation from multiple defensive positions. According to tactical doctrine, this approach was impossible without overwhelming suppressive fire and numerical superiority. But doctrine assumed conventional limitations, and these men had systematically destroyed their acceptance of such limitations. Chen moved first, carrying explosive charges that would breach the compound walls. His weak self had been the young man who calculated risks for personal benefit, who preserved energy for his own survival, who accepted that some things were too dangerous to attempt. That man no longer existed. What moved across the open ground was something harder, something forged through years of choosing discipline over comfort, duty over safety, mission accomplishment over personal preservation. Rodriguez followed, his movements economical and precise despite the weight of additional ammunition and medical supplies. His weak self had been the man who considered his own family's needs before those of strangers, who calculated the personal cost of heroic action, who preserved himself for his own future rather than risking everything for others. That man had died through countless small choices to put duty before convenience, service before self-interest, honor before survival. One by one, 20 men moved across ground that should have been impossible to cross, their success predicated not on superior firepower or tactical advantage, but on the systematic destruction of the part of themselves that accepted impossibility. They had become living proof of the ancient truth that external circumstances cannot defeat a man who has conquered his own limitations. The enemy fire, when it came, was precisely as devastating as the intelligence estimates had predicted. Automatic weapons fire swept the approaches to the compound in overlapping patterns designed to make advancement impossible. Explosive devices detonated with calculated timing to channel the assault into predetermined kill zones. Defensive positions revealed themselves in coordinated sequence to maximize the effectiveness of their fire. But the 20 men advancing through that fire had prepared for exactly this moment through years of training under stress, of pushing beyond apparent limitations, of refusing to accept the voice within that counseled retreat, compromise, or self-preservation. They moved not because they were unafraid, but because they had learned to act effectively despite fear. They advanced not because they were immune to danger, but because they had systematically destroyed the part of themselves that allowed danger to dictate their choices. Thompson, the communications specialist, took a round through his left shoulder but continued to coordinate fire support and maintain contact with command. His weak self would have used the wound as justification for seeking cover, for prioritizing his own medical needs, for accepting reduced effectiveness. But that version of Thompson had died during SEAL training when he learned that physical pain was a sensation to be acknowledged and overcome, not a limitation to be accepted. The breach of the compound walls required precision timing and absolute commitment to action despite overwhelming defensive fire. Chen placed his charges not because the tactical situation favored success, but because the mission required it, and he had destroyed every part of himself that might hesitate due to personal risk calculation. The explosions that followed opened the way forward, but they also announced to every defender in the compound that 20 men were willing to die rather than accept failure. As the team flowed through the breach, Hayes understood that what they were demonstrating was not just tactical skill or physical courage. They were proving the fundamental truth that had driven warrior cultures throughout history, that a man who has systematically destroyed his own weakness becomes something that external circumstances cannot touch. The enemy had prepared defenses based on the assumption that their attackers would be limited by normal human concerns for personal survival. They had calculated fields of fire based on the expectation that soldiers would seek cover when fired upon, would retreat when faced with overwhelming odds, would prioritize their own lives when confronted with probable death. But these 20 men had spent years systematically destroying those normal human limitations. They had trained themselves to advance under fire not because they enjoyed being shot at, but because they had eliminated the part of themselves that allowed enemy action to dictate their own choices. They had learned to continue when continuation seemed impossible, not because they couldn't feel pain or fear, but because they had destroyed the voice within that translated pain and fear into limitations on their actions. Part 3, The Forge of Legend. Inside the compound, the true test began. The intelligence briefings had been accurate about the defensive preparations, but they had underestimated the psychological warfare that awaited the rescue team. The terrorists had prepared not just physical obstacles, but moral ones designed to break the will of anyone attempting rescue. The first room they breached contained 2 of the hostages, a woman and a young child, bound to explosive devices with deadman switches held by their captors. The setup was diabolical in its simplicity. Any attempt to neutralize the terrorists would result in the detonation of the explosives and the death of the very people the SEALs had come to save. It was a perfect trap designed to paralyze rescue efforts by making success impossible and failure unacceptable. Hayes understood immediately that they faced something beyond tactical complexity. This was psychological warfare designed to exploit the very humanity that had brought them here. The enemy had created a situation where their natural instinct to protect innocent life would be turned against them, where their desire to save the hostages would make saving them impossible. But these 20 men had spent years preparing for exactly this type of moral complexity. They had trained not just their bodies and minds, but their characters. They had learned to make impossible decisions under pressure, to calculate moral mathematics in seconds, to act decisively when action meant accepting responsibility for consequences that might haunt them forever. Rodriguez moved first, his actions based not on emotion but on cold calculation of the only path that offered any possibility of success. His approach to the first terrorist was economical, precise, and executed with the understanding that hesitation meant death for everyone in the room. The terrorist fell without triggering the explosive device, but only because Rodriguez had trained himself to act with mechanical precision even when the stakes were absolute. Chen followed, his demolitions expertise allowing him to quickly assess and disarm the explosive device while Thompson provided cover and medical assistance to the freed hostages. The coordination between them was seamless, not because they had rehearsed this exact scenario, but because they had trained themselves to function as a single unit regardless of the specific challenges they faced. The rescue of the first 2 hostages had taken less than 90 seconds, but it had required the integration of years of preparation, training, and character development. Each action had been performed by men who had systematically destroyed every part of themselves that might hesitate, calculate personal risk, or prioritize their own safety over mission success. But the compound contained 15 more hostages in similar situations, and each successive room presented new moral and tactical complexities. The enemy had prepared different scenarios in each location, designed to test different aspects of the rescue team's resolve and capability. Some rooms contained multiple terrorists with overlapping deadman switches. Others had been rigged with time-delayed explosives that would detonate regardless of the terrorists' survival. Still others presented the choice between saving hostages and preventing terrorist escape with information that could lead to further attacks. As they moved deeper into the compound, Hayes began to understand that what they were experiencing was not just a rescue mission but a comprehensive test of everything they had built themselves into. Each room demanded a different combination of physical skill, tactical knowledge, moral courage, and psychological strength. The enemy had created a multi-dimensional puzzle that required not just professional competence but the integration of character traits that took years to develop. The 4th room they entered contained a scenario that would have broken most men: 3 children bound to a single explosive device with a timer counting down from 60 seconds. The terrorists in the room had already fled, leaving only the explosive and the terrified children. There was no way to disarm the device in time, no way to safely evacuate the children, and no apparent solution that didn't result in tragedy. But Chen's weak self, the man who accepted limitations imposed by circumstances, had died years ago during training. What remained was someone who refused to accept that any situation was without solution. Instead of calculating the impossibility of the scenario, he focused on the single element that might be manipulated, the device itself. Working with a precision that seemed impossible under such pressure, Chen began not to disarm the explosive but to redirect its force. Using materials from his pack and knowledge gained through years of studying demolitions, he constructed a shaped charge that would channel the explosion upward through the roof rather than outward toward the children. The technique had never been taught in any manual because it required improvisation under extreme pressure with materials never intended for such use. But Chen had spent years destroying the part of himself that accepted the limitations of conventional training. He had learned to think beyond established procedures, to innovate when innovation seemed impossible, to find solutions that existed only in the space between conventional wisdom and desperate necessity. The explosion, when it came, blew a hole through the roof of the compound and filled the room with debris, but the 3 children survived. They were unconscious from the concussion and covered with dust, but they were alive because one man had refused to accept that their deaths were inevitable. Rodriguez and Thompson extracted the children while Hayes and the rest of the team continued toward the remaining hostages.
Each step deeper into the compound revealed new evidence of the enemy's psychological preparation.
They had anticipated not just a rescue attempt but specifically a rescue attempt by elite forces. They had prepared scenarios designed to break the will of highly trained soldiers by forcing them to choose between mission success and personal honor, between saving some lives and saving all lives, between acting quickly and acting perfectly. But they had not anticipated men who had systematically destroyed the part of themselves that could be broken by such choices. They had prepared for soldiers who would be limited by normal human psychology, by conventional training, by standard operating procedures. They had not prepared for 20 men who had spent years learning to operate beyond normal human limitations. The 7th room contained what appeared to be the compound's command center, with sophisticated communications equipment and detailed intelligence about future terrorist operations. The tactical value of capturing this information was enormous. It could prevent multiple future attacks and save hundreds of lives. But the room also contained 4 hostages rigged to explosives that would detonate if anyone approached the intelligence materials. The choice was stark: save 4 lives now or gather information that could save hundreds later. Conventional tactical doctrine had no answer for such a scenario because it assumed limitations on acceptable risk and loss. But these men had systematically destroyed their acceptance of such limitations. Hayes made the decision in seconds, not because he was callous about the 4 hostages, but because he had trained himself to calculate moral mathematics under pressure without allowing emotion to cloud strategic thinking. The intelligence had to be secured, even if it meant accepting responsibility for the deaths of 4 innocent people. But, as the team moved to implement his decision, something unexpected happened. Thompson, working with his communications equipment, discovered that the explosive devices weren't actually rigged to detonate when the intelligence was accessed. They were rigged to detonate when the terrorists sent a remote signal, which meant that securing the communications equipment would actually save the hostages by preventing the terrorists from triggering the explosives. The discovery changed everything. Instead of choosing between saving lives and gathering intelligence, they could do both by acting quickly enough to prevent the remote detonation. But quickly enough meant moving faster than anyone had a right to expect, with precision that left no margin for error. Chen reached the communications equipment first, his demolitions expertise allowing him to quickly identify and sever the transmission lines before any detonation signal could be sent. Rodriguez simultaneously moved to extract the hostages while Thompson secured the intelligence materials. The coordination required split-second timing and absolute trust that each man would perform his part perfectly. They succeeded because they had trained for exactly this type of complex, multi-dimensional challenge. More importantly, they succeeded because they had destroyed the part of themselves that hesitated when action was required, that calculated personal risk when others were depending on them, that accepted limitations imposed by circumstances. As they moved toward the final section of the compound where the remaining hostages were believed to be held, Hayes reflected on what they had accomplished and what it revealed about human potential. 20 men, faced with a situation that tactical analysis had deemed impossible, had systematically overcome each obstacle not through superior firepower or favorable odds, but through the systematic destruction of their own limitations. Each challenge had tested a different aspect of their preparation: physical conditioning, tactical knowledge, technical expertise, moral courage, psychological strength, and the ability to function as a coordinated unit under extreme pressure. But underlying all of these specific capabilities was the fundamental transformation that had made everything else possible. They had learned to destroy the weak version of themselves that accepted limitations. The final room contained 8 hostages and what appeared to be the terrorist leadership. Unlike the previous scenarios, this one offered no clever solution, no technical workaround, no way to avoid direct confrontation with overwhelming odds. The terrorists were prepared for a final stand, had rigged the entire room with explosives, and had positioned themselves to maximize casualties among both rescuers and hostages. But Hayes and his men had prepared for exactly this moment through years of training and character development. They had learned that some situations could only be resolved through the willingness to act decisively despite probable personal destruction. They had destroyed the part of themselves that calculated odds for personal benefit and rebuilt something that calculated only mission success. The final assault lasted less than 5 minutes, but it required the integration of everything they had built themselves into over years of preparation. Each man performed multiple functions simultaneously. Rodriguez provided medical care to wounded hostages while engaging terrorists with precision fire. Chen disarmed explosive devices while coordinating movement through the room. Thompson maintained communications with extraction forces while providing tactical intelligence to his teammates. When the shooting stopped, all 8 hostages were alive, though several required immediate medical attention. Of the terrorist leadership, those who survived were taken into custody along with intelligence materials that would prevent multiple future attacks. The mission that tactical analysis had deemed impossible had been completed successfully. But success had come at a cost. Of the 20 men who had entered the compound, 3 would not be returning home. Petty Officer Johnson had died instantly when shrapnel from an explosive device severed his carotid artery. Sergeant Williams had been killed while shielding hostages from terrorist fire. Petty Officer Martinez had succumbed to wounds sustained during the final assault while providing cover for the extraction of wounded hostages. As Hayes looked at the faces of his surviving men, he understood that what they had accomplished transcended the specific tactical success of this mission. They had proven something fundamental about human potential, that a man who systematically destroys his own weakness becomes something that external circumstances cannot touch. They had demonstrated that the ancient truth about character and courage was not merely philosophical but practical. The extraction helicopters arrived as dawn broke over the Afghan mountains, and 17 rescued hostages were loaded aboard along with the surviving members of the rescue team. As they lifted off into the morning sky, Hayes reflected on the transformation that had made this night possible. Each of the men under his command had begun as an ordinary person with ordinary limitations. Through years of training, discipline, and the systematic destruction of their weaker selves, they had become something extraordinary. They had learned that courage was not the absence of fear but action despite fear. They had discovered that strength was not the absence of weakness but the refusal to be limited by weakness. They had proven that the man who destroys his weak self truly cannot be destroyed by others. 3 men had paid the ultimate price for this lesson, but their sacrifice had meaning beyond the specific lives they had saved. They had demonstrated that honor, duty, and service to others could overcome any external obstacle. They had shown that the human spirit, properly forged and directed, was stronger than any enemy, any circumstance, any limitation that the world might impose. The helicopter carrying the survivors and the rescued hostages disappeared into the dawn sky, leaving behind only the smoking remains of a terrorist compound and the quiet testimony of what ordinary men could accomplish when they chose to destroy their own limitations. The official reports would classify the mission details, but the truth of what had been proven that night would live on in the character of every man who had participated in it. They had learned the ultimate lesson of special operations, that the most dangerous enemy is not the one who threatens your life, but the one who lives within your own mind, the voice that counsels limitation, compromise, and self-preservation. Once that enemy is destroyed through discipline, training, and the systematic choice of difficulty over ease, the man who remains becomes something that no external force can defeat. 20 men had entered that compound as highly trained soldiers. 17 had emerged as living proof of humanity's ultimate potential, the transformation from ordinary limitation to extraordinary capability through the deliberate destruction of everything weak within themselves. They had become legends not through what they had accomplished, but through what they had chosen to become in order to accomplish it. The rescue mission would remain classified, the details known only to those who had lived them and those who had authorized them. But the truth demonstrated that night would echo through time and the character of every person willing to undertake the same transformation, the systematic destruction of their weak self in service of something greater than their own survival. In the end, they had proven that the man who destroys his weak self truly cannot be destroyed by others, not because he becomes invincible, but because he becomes something more valuable than invincible. He becomes uncompromising in his commitment to what matters most, regardless of the personal cost. And that transformation, once achieved, makes everything else possible.